In the summer of 1931, China faced one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, the 1931 China floods, also known as the Yangtze-Huai River floods. Spanning from June to August, these floods devastated central and eastern China, leaving a trail of destruction and loss across major cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and beyond. This catastrophe was not just an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of extreme weather conditions that had plagued the region for several years. The backstory of these floods begins in the late 1920s, when China was already grappling with severe droughts from 1928 to 1930. These droughts had a significant impact on the country, drying up rivers and reducing water levels to dangerous lows. But the winter of 1930 brought a harsh twist, as heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures covered the mountainous areas with thick layers of snow and ice. As the winter gave way to spring in 1931, this snow and ice began to melt, and the resulting water flowed downstream into the Yangtze River. Ordinarily, the Yangtze River and its surrounding areas experience seasonal flooding during the spring, summer, and fall. However, the continuous melting combined with heavy rainfall in early 1931 created a situation that was far from ordinary. By June, those living in low-lying areas along the river had already been forced to abandon their homes as water levels rose at an alarming rate. The summer of 1931 was marked by intense cyclonic activity, with 9 cyclones hitting the region in July alone, far above the average of 2 per year. These cyclones brought unprecedented amounts of rain, further swelling the rivers and causing water levels to reach new heights. By the time the floodwaters peaked in August, much of central and eastern China was underwater. The floodwaters inundated an area of about 180,000 square kilometers, roughly equivalent in size to the combined states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Cities like Wuhan were submerged, and the scale of the disaster was so immense that it quickly overwhelmed local authorities and communities. This introduction sets the stage for understanding how the 1931 floods developed into one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The combination of natural factors, ranging from severe droughts and harsh winters to unrelenting cyclones, created a perfect storm that would lead to untold devastation in the months to come. As we move forward, we'll explore how these events unfolded, the sheer scale of destruction that followed, and the lasting impact of this disaster on China and its people. As 1931 began, a series of environmental conditions converged to create the perfect storm for what would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. In the years leading up to the flood, China had experienced a long drought from 1928 to 1930, which left the ground parched and unable to absorb water effectively. The winter of 1930-1931 was particularly harsh, with severe cold spells that deposited large amounts of snow and ice across the mountainous regions. This snow and ice were set to become a major factor in the unfolding disaster. As the harsh winter gave way to spring, the snow and ice began to melt rapidly, sending torrents of water downstream into the Yangtze River and its tributaries. Ordinarily, this region would experience 3 distinct periods of high water: spring, summer, and fall. But in 1931, the water flow was relentless, combining all 3 high water periods into one continuous, overwhelming deluge. As early as June, the situation was already dire, with heavy rains compounding the melting snow and ice. The Yangtze River swelled to levels not seen since records began, causing those living in low-lying areas to abandon their homes in fear of what was to come. Adding to the chaos, the summer of 1931 saw an unprecedented level of cyclonic activity. 9 cyclones struck the region in July alone, a sharp increase from the usual 2 per year. The torrential rains brought by these storms saturated the ground further, with 4 weather stations along the Yangtze River reporting rainfall exceeding 600 millimeters for the month. The river, already swollen from months of heavy water flow, reached dangerously high levels, pushing against dikes and levees that had held firm for decades. Despite the growing danger, preparations for such a catastrophe were minimal. The flood control infrastructure, already weakened by years of neglect and mismanagement, was simply not equipped to handle the massive volume of water. Communities along the river, already strained from years of drought and economic hardship, were caught off guard by the severity of the situation. Efforts to strengthen dikes and build temporary barriers were quickly overwhelmed as the water levels continued to rise. By late July, it was clear that a disaster of unprecedented scale was imminent. The river's water levels were now at their highest point in living memory, and the first signs of flooding began to appear in low-lying areas. People scrambled to save what they could, but the sheer magnitude of the impending flood left little time for effective evacuation. The stage was set for the 1931 China floods to unleash their full fury on the unsuspecting population. The catastrophic impact of the 1931 China floods began to fully manifest in August. The relentless rains continued, and the Yangtze River, along with other major rivers like the Huai and Yellow Rivers, could no longer contain the immense volume of water. On August 1st, the Yangtze River burst its banks, and the floodwaters surged into the surrounding countryside, overwhelming dikes and inundating vast areas of land. Entire towns and villages were swallowed by the advancing waters. The floods swept through the landscape with unstoppable force, destroying homes, farmlands, and infrastructure. Roads and railways were submerged, cutting off communication and transportation routes, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach the affected areas. The situation was dire, and the people caught in the flood's path had little chance to escape. As the floodwaters spread, the scale of the devastation became clearer. The city of Wuhan, one of China's most important industrial and commercial centers, was among the hardest hit. The city was submerged under several feet of water, leaving only the tops of buildings visible in some areas. The residents of Wuhan, along with millions of others across the floodplain, were forced to seek refuge on rooftops, in trees, and on any high ground they could find. Many clung to makeshift rafts or debris, desperately trying to survive. In the countryside, the situation was even more grim. The floodwaters turned fertile farmlands into vast muddy lakes. Crops that were nearing harvest were destroyed, leading to widespread food shortages. Livestock drowned in the rising waters, further exacerbating the looming famine. The floods also displaced millions of people, leaving them homeless and without access to clean water, food, or medical care. The death toll began to climb rapidly. Drowning claimed the lives of countless individuals in the immediate aftermath of the flood, but the disaster's impact went far beyond the initial surge of water. The stagnant floodwaters became breeding grounds for disease, and epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in which survivors were forced to live. Malnutrition and exposure to the elements further weakened the already vulnerable population. The government, already stretched thin by economic troubles and political instability, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. Relief efforts were hampered by the scale of the disaster and the sheer number of people in need. Local authorities and international aid organizations did what they could, but resources were limited and the needs were overwhelming. As the floodwaters slowly receded, they left behind a landscape of devastation. The physical destruction was immense, but the human toll was even greater. The 1931 China floods were not just a natural disaster, but a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The country would be left to grapple with the aftermath for years to come. In the aftermath of the 1931 China floods, the devastation was almost unimaginable. As the floodwaters gradually receded, they revealed a landscape utterly transformed by the disaster. Farmlands that had once been lush and fertile were now barren, coated in a thick layer of silt and debris. The flood had destroyed crops, homes, and infrastructure, leaving millions of people without shelter or means of livelihood. The immediate concern in the weeks following the flood was the humanitarian crisis. With millions of people displaced, there was an urgent need for food, clean water, and medical care. Relief efforts were mounted, but they were hampered by the sheer scale of the disaster. Roads and railways remained damaged or submerged, making it difficult to transport supplies to the worst affected areas. The government, already struggling with internal political instability, found it challenging to coordinate a response on such a massive scale. In the refugee camps that sprung up across the region, conditions were dire. Overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions led to the rapid spread of diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever claimed thousands of lives, adding to the already staggering death toll. The lack of adequate food supplies resulted in widespread malnutrition, and many survivors succumbed to hunger and disease. The social impact of the floods was profound. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones to the floodwaters or the subsequent epidemics. The loss of homes and livelihoods meant that entire communities were plunged into poverty, with little hope of recovery in the near term. The psychological trauma of the disaster left deep scars on the survivors, many of whom had witnessed unimaginable horrors during the flood. The economic consequences were equally severe. The destruction of farmlands and the loss of the harvest led to food shortages and skyrocketing prices. The agricultural sector, which was the backbone of China's economy at the time, was decimated. This in turn led to a sharp increase in poverty and unemployment, as farmers and laborers found themselves without work. The disaster also had long-term political repercussions. The government's inadequate response to the crisis fueled public dissatisfaction and unrest. The inability to provide effective relief and the perceived indifference of the authorities to the suffering of the people undermined the government's legitimacy and contributed to the growing sense of discontent across the country. International aid did arrive, but it was not enough to meet the overwhelming needs of the affected population. While various relief organizations and foreign governments provided assistance, the scale of the disaster meant that many people continued to suffer for months and even years after the floodwaters had receded. The 1931 China floods were a turning point in the nation's history. They exposed the vulnerabilities of the country's infrastructure and governance and highlighted the need for better disaster preparedness and response. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would eventually lead to changes in flood control measures and disaster management strategies, but for those who lived through it, the impact of the floods would be felt for a lifetime. The legacy of the 1931 China floods is a somber reminder of the catastrophic power of natural disasters and the profound impact they can have on society. In the years that followed, efforts were made to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. The government began investing in more comprehensive flood control measures, including the construction of dams, levees, and improved drainage systems. These initiatives were aimed at better managing the country's vast river systems and reducing the risk of future floods. One of the key lessons learned from the 1931 floods was the importance of early warning systems in disaster preparedness. The lack of timely information and coordinated response had exacerbated the scale of the disaster. In response, meteorological and hydrological monitoring systems were gradually improved, allowing for more accurate predictions of potential floods and better planning for evacuation and relief efforts. However, the memory of the 1931 floods also served as a stark reminder of the need for sustainable development and environmental stewardship. Deforestation, land reclamation, and other practices that disrupted natural water flows were recognized as contributing factors to the severity of the floods. This realization led to increased awareness of the importance of protecting natural ecosystems as a means of mitigating the impact of future floods. On a social level, the floods had a lasting impact on the people of China. The survivors carried with them the trauma and loss of the disaster, and the event became a defining moment in the collective memory of the nation. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of resilience, as communities came together to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. The 1931 China floods remain one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, with an estimated death toll ranging from 1 million to 4 million people. The exact number may never be known, but the scale of the tragedy is undeniable. The disaster highlighted the need for stronger infrastructure, better disaster preparedness, and a more compassionate response to those in need. In the decades since, China has made significant strides in disaster management and flood control. Modern technology and improved infrastructure have reduced the risk of such a catastrophic event occurring again. Yet, the memory of the 1931 floods continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the human cost of environmental neglect. As we reflect on the 1931 China floods, we are reminded of the delicate balance between nature and human civilization. It is a balance that requires constant attention and respect, for when it is disrupted, the consequences can be devastating. The floods of 1931 are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity and a sobering reminder of the need to protect our environment and prepare for the challenges that nature may bring. In the year 1099, a devastating natural disaster struck the coasts of England and the Netherlands, causing catastrophic floods that would be remembered for centuries. The event, known as the Great Coastal Floods of 1099, was one of the earliest recorded instances of extreme flooding along these shores. This disaster affected large areas of the North Sea coast, including parts of Belgium, and caused immense loss of life and property. The floods hit at a time when communities in these regions were highly vulnerable, with many living near rivers and coastal areas that were prone to flooding. The earliest records of these floods come from England, particularly in the area around the Thames estuary. The The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that the sea came out upon the shore with a force and scale that had never been witnessed before. Reports from the time indicate that a significant portion of land was submerged, including a famous estate owned by Earl Goodwin, which would later become known as the Goodwin Sands. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, the floodwaters caused similar devastation, with coastal villages and towns overwhelmed by the rising tides. This disaster is said to have claimed the lives of around 100,000 people, making it one of the deadliest floods in history. These coastal floods were not just limited to one area, but spread across various regions, from the River Thames in England to the low-lying coasts of the Netherlands. This widespread flooding was an unprecedented event, shocking communities across both countries. It marked a tragic point in history, setting the stage for further discussions about the causes and impact of such natural disasters in the years to come. The great coastal floods of 1099 were triggered by a powerful combination of natural forces that took the people of England and the Netherlands by surprise. Leading up to the disaster, weather patterns had become increasingly unstable, and a series of heavy storms began to build along the North Sea coastlines. These storms intensified in strength, creating what historians now suspect was a wind-driven storm surge. This surge, combined with an exceptionally high tide, pushed vast amounts of seawater inland, overwhelming the coastal defenses. In England, the riverbanks of the Thames were already vulnerable, but the sudden surge made any preparations impossible. Towns near the Thames estuary and along the English coast found themselves facing a rising wall of water with little warning. The people, unaware of the scale of the threat, had no way to prepare for the destruction that was coming. Similarly, in the Netherlands, the low-lying coastal areas stood no chance against the fast-approaching storm surge. Villages and farms were situated dangerously close to the sea, and once the tide began to rise, there was little time to react. On the first day of the flood, the water levels surged at an alarming rate, catching many off guard. Communities along the English and Dutch coasts scrambled to protect themselves, but the sheer force of the storm overwhelmed them. The floodwaters crept further inland than ever before, submerging vast stretches of land. Houses, crops, and livestock were washed away as the flood moved relentlessly forward. These early hours of the flood set the stage for the widespread devastation that would follow in the days to come. As the great coastal floods of 1099 unfolded, the sheer power and devastation became more apparent with each passing day. The rising waters surged through England and the Netherlands, sweeping away everything in their path. In England, the Thames River overflowed its banks in multiple areas, especially near the river's mouth, where the low-lying lands offered little resistance. The waters reached deep into the countryside, drowning entire villages and farmlands. The famous estate of Earl Goodwin was submerged completely, and the area soon became what we now know as Goodwin Sands. The Netherlands faced similar destruction. Low-lying coastal regions were flooded quickly, and homes, farms, and even entire communities were swallowed by the rising tide. People who lived close to the coast had nowhere to flee as the water advanced faster than expected. In both countries, the floodwaters moved with such force that they carried away not only buildings and animals, but also people. Thousands were swept out to sea or trapped by the waters as they rose. The loss of life was catastrophic. Many chronicles from the time describe how men, women, and children were buried beneath the water, with their homes and possessions disappearing in the waves. In England, the flooding was particularly severe near the Thames estuary, but the disaster reached much further inland than anyone could have predicted. The destructive force of the floodwaters reshaped the landscape, leaving behind ruins, debris, and stories of incredible loss. The flood raged on for days, with high tides and strong winds, making any rescue efforts nearly impossible. The people left behind were forced to endure days of relentless flooding, watching as their world was washed away. By the time the waters finally began to recede, the damage was already immense, and the full impact of the disaster was just beginning to be understood. The aftermath of the great coastal floods of 1099 left both England and the Netherlands in ruins. The destruction to the land and infrastructure was immense, with vast stretches of farmland completely ruined by the salty floodwaters. Crops were wiped out, leading to severe food shortages in the affected areas. Homes that had stood for generations were now nothing more than wreckage, their remains scattered across the waterlogged landscape. In England, the areas near the Thames estuary were among the hardest hit. Villages that once thrived along the riverbanks were gone, leaving only debris behind. The estate of Earl Goodwin, once a symbol of prosperity, was swallowed by the flood and transformed into a vast sandbank, which came to be known as Goodwin Sands. The flooding reshaped parts of the English coastline, creating new sandbanks and altering the flow of rivers. Thousands of acres of land were left unusable, buried under mud and debris. The floodwaters also destroyed livestock and essential food stores, further straining the surviving population. In the Netherlands, the low-lying coastal regions suffered even greater devastation. The floods overwhelmed the protective dikes, causing even more widespread destruction. Entire villages disappeared beneath the waters, and the fertile farmlands were turned into desolate wastelands. The Dutch coastline, which had already been vulnerable, was drastically altered by the floods, with vast sections of land reclaimed by the sea. The destruction was not just physical. The floods also took a heavy toll on the people, leaving behind a traumatized population, many of whom had lost family, homes, and livelihoods. The loss of life was staggering, with reports suggesting that up to 100,000 people perished in the floods. Both England and the Netherlands faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, but the scale of the destruction made recovery difficult. In the months and years that followed, the survivors struggled to find shelter, food, and resources, as much of what they relied on had been washed away. The long-term impact of the great coastal floods was felt for years, as the affected regions faced famine, disease, and economic hardship in the wake of the disaster. The great coastal floods of 1099 left an indelible mark on both England and the Netherlands, shaping their history in profound ways. The massive loss of life, with an estimated 100,000 people killed, remains one of the most tragic natural disasters of the medieval period. The physical landscape was forever altered, with sandbanks like Goodwin Sands serving as a constant reminder of the devastation. The floods reshaped coastlines and claimed fertile lands, leaving behind a legacy of loss and hardship for the survivors. In the immediate aftermath, communities had to rebuild from scratch. The floodwaters had not only destroyed homes and infrastructure, but also wiped out food supplies and livestock, leading to famine in some regions. Disease spread in the unsanitary conditions that followed the flood, further compounding the suffering of the population. Both England and the Netherlands were forced to rethink their flood protection measures. In the centuries that followed, particularly in the Netherlands, stronger dikes and flood defenses were developed as a response to the vulnerabilities exposed by the disaster. The great coastal floods of 1099 also left a deep psychological impact on the people of the time. Stories and legends about the floods, such as the tale of Goodwin Sands, were passed down through generations, serving as both warnings and memories of the unpredictable power of nature. For those who survived, the disaster was a stark reminder of their fragility in the face of natural forces beyond their control. Ultimately, the great coastal floods of 1099 were a turning point in how people in both England and the Netherlands viewed their relationship with the sea. The disaster underscored the need for greater protection and planning to prevent future tragedies, and it set the stage for the development of more advanced flood defense systems in the centuries to come. Despite the immense destruction, the resilience of the survivors and the lessons learned from this catastrophe became part of the enduring history of these coastal nations. The Banqiao Dam, located in China's Henan province, was part of an ambitious effort to control flooding in the Huai River basin. Built in the 1950s, the dam was designed with the best available technology at the time, intended to prevent the devastating seasonal floods that had plagued the region for centuries. Spanning over 380 meters wide and standing more than 118 meters tall, Banqiao was a symbol of progress in modern engineering. Initially, the dam was seen as a success, holding back immense quantities of water during the rainy seasons and protecting the nearby towns and villages from the historical flooding that had claimed so many lives in the past. However, behind its impressive structure lay vulnerabilities that would later be exposed in a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. The reliance on outdated engineering models and insufficient attention to safety measures left the dam in a precarious position, especially in the face of an extreme weather event. Adding to this was a growing political pressure during China's Great Leap Forward. Speed in construction was prioritized, and some design features, like its spillway capacity, were underdeveloped. Local populations were unaware of these limitations, continuing to build and thrive in the dam's protective shadow, unaware of the growing risk. But in 1975, nature would put the dam's limits to the ultimate test. In early August 1975, Typhoon Nina formed off the coast of Taiwan, initially expected to weaken before reaching mainland China. However, what followed was a dramatic intensification that no one could have predicted. By the time Typhoon Nina made landfall in the Henan province, it had transformed into a powerful and sustained weather event, bringing with it an unrelenting deluge of rain over several days. As the storm approached, meteorologists grew increasingly concerned about the potential strain on the country's dam infrastructure. The Banqiao Dam, in particular, was identified as being in a vulnerable position due to its reliance on spillways that had not been designed for such extreme levels of rainfall. Between August 5th and 7th, the region experienced unprecedented downpours, with over 1,600 millimeters of rain falling, equivalent to what the area would normally receive in an entire year. The torrential rains exceeded even the most conservative projections, triggering flash floods, landslides, and swelling rivers. Government officials and engineers tried to manage the rapidly rising water levels, but their efforts were hampered by miscommunication and outdated data. The evacuation of the surrounding areas was delayed as authorities hoped the dam would hold, relying on faulty assumptions about its design's resilience. As water continued to rise, the situation became critical. With the storm still raging, the dam's reservoirs were soon filled beyond capacity, and the spillways designed to release excess water were simply inadequate to cope with the overwhelming volume. Despite the increasing danger, local residents remained largely unaware of the looming disaster. On the night of August 8, 1975, after days of relentless rain, the Banqiao Dam reached its breaking point. Cracks started to appear along the structure as the dam could no longer hold back the overwhelming pressure of the floodwaters. In the early hours of August 8th, the dam finally gave way, releasing a staggering 700 million cubic meters of water in a matter of hours. The collapse unleashed an unstoppable tidal wave, estimated to be over 10 kilometers wide and traveling at a speed of nearly 50 kilometers per hour. The water ripped through the countryside, obliterating everything in its path. Entire villages were washed away in minutes as the floodwaters surged through the plains. Houses, roads, farms, and infrastructure were destroyed, leaving nothing but devastation behind. The sheer force of the water was unimaginable as it uprooted trees, overturned vehicles, and swept away bridges, cutting off escape routes and isolating entire communities. The destruction was exacerbated by the collapse of several other smaller dams downstream, creating a domino effect that magnified the impact of the flood. The people living in the floodplains had no time to react. Without adequate warning systems in place, most were asleep when the dam broke, unaware of the wall of water rushing toward them. In the space of a few hours, what had been a landscape of farmland and small villages was transformed into a vast lifeless lake of mud and debris. Over 85,000 people are estimated to have drowned in the immediate aftermath of the dam's collapse. The collapse of the Banqiao Dam was only the beginning of the disaster. In the days and weeks that followed, the situation grew even worse as survivors faced a severe humanitarian crisis. With entire towns submerged and infrastructure wiped out, the region was plunged into chaos. Food and clean drinking water were in short supply, and the destruction of roads and bridges made it almost impossible for rescue teams to reach the hardest-hit areas. In addition to the flood-related deaths, an estimated 145,000 people died from the secondary effects of the disaster. Disease outbreaks spread quickly in the aftermath, as the lack of clean water and proper sanitation contributed to the rapid spread of illness. Malnutrition became rampant, as crops were destroyed and livestock drowned in the floodwaters, cutting off food supplies for the surviving population. Many survivors were forced to live in makeshift shelters with little to no medical assistance, as hospitals and clinics had been swept away or severely damaged. The Chinese government, already dealing with political challenges and economic strains, struggled to mount an effective response. Relief efforts were slow to mobilize, and with communications down in much of the region, it took days before the full extent of the disaster was even understood by the outside world. As rescue teams finally reached the isolated areas, the scale of the damage became painfully clear. Millions of people were displaced and entire communities had been wiped off the map. The survivors faced not only the loss of their homes, but also the devastating emotional toll of losing family members, neighbors, and entire livelihoods in a matter of hours. The Banqiao Dam disaster remains one of the deadliest dam failures in history, with a death toll estimated to exceed 230,000 people. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the disaster had a profound impact on China's approach to engineering, disaster preparedness, and emergency response. It exposed the risks of underestimating the power of natural disasters, as well as the consequences of prioritizing speed and political goals over safety in construction projects. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, China implemented major reforms in its dam building policies. Stricter safety regulations were introduced, and many of the country's older dams were retrofitted or rebuilt to withstand extreme weather events. The government also invested in improved early warning systems and flood control measures to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. Additionally, there was a growing acknowledgement of the importance of transparency and accurate communication between authorities and the public, as the delay in evacuating affected areas had been a major factor in the high death toll. Despite these changes, the Banqiao Dam disaster remains a somber reminder of the devastating consequences when infrastructure fails. The survivors, many of whom lost everything in the floods, continue to live with the memory of that tragic night, and the region itself has never fully recovered from the damage. Today, the story of Banqiao serves as a cautionary tale for countries around the world, highlighting the need for rigorous safety standards, proper maintenance, and proactive disaster management to protect against the unpredictable forces of nature.